in the form of an axolotl compared to a human, clearly we cannot regenerate our limbs. So I'm going to be talking about some assistive technologies and augmenting technologies that we can obtain inspiration from robotics, and we can see how far we can get in the future. So the title of my talk is Augmenting Human Performance with Robotics, Present Implementations and State of the Art. So before I begin, I actually wanted to start by defining what I mean by augment. And I'm going to be doing this a couple times throughout the talk, so we're totally clear with everything I'm trying to portray. And what I mean by augment is to make something greater by adding to it. So the whole idea of actually using artificial limbs is really nothing new. In fact, we see here in the leftmost figure, illustration of primitive artificial limbs, where a lower limb amputee several years ago obtained some sort of aesthetic or functional device for a lower limb prosthetic. Similarly, in the Egyptian dynasty in 2750 BC, we see a big toe on the right foot. And about 7 to 8 months ago, they actually found this 3,500-year-old bronze hand. Now, a lot of the times, especially being from several millennia ago, these were usually for aesthetic purposes rather than always functional. But now, since we have such technology through robotics, we could actually make these functional. So before I begin talking a lot about prosthetics and exoskeletons, I wanted to first define and really tell everyone the origination of the word robot. So it actually came from a Czech play in 1920 called Rossum's Universal Robots by Karel Čapek. It was very popular. It was translated into 30 languages by 1923, just in 3 years. And what it depicted were these artificial beings called roboti, and they were made of artificial matter in factories, and of course they did all the things that humans didn't want to do, like wash the dishes or mow your lawn. And naturally, like any good play, they end up communicating with one another and end up taking over the world. So the big question now with robotics and augmenting technologies is, where are we now? So this work came out from OpenAI in 2018, which is a machine learning lab. And what it depicts is a hand called a shadow hand. It's a $150,000 robot hand, and it is performing what we call in robotics as the task of dexterous manipulation. Now the human hand, by simplifying it, I will say we have 21 joints in our human hand, which basically means in order to fully define the state of our hand, we need 21 variables. So traditionally, controls theorists and roboticists have had a really hard time actually being able to control a human hand, especially for advanced dexterous manipulation tasks. Here, using machine learning, they were actually able to train on over 100 years of simulated data. And in doing so, they trained it over different colors and were able to finally manipulate this cube. Just because I use the word machine learning, I will very loosely define it, and it's the process of automatically extracting patterns from data. And we see this a lot, especially when it comes to robotics. So I want to introduce you to Atlas. It is a humanoid robot from Boston Dynamics. Maybe we've seen this video before in the news. What Atlas is really good at doing is what we call locomotion, being able to interact with his or her environment, and the robot's able to actually do something as cool as actually doing a backflip. And just for clarification, there is no human in this robot. This is just a robot. Another thing that we've gotten really good at is what I will call robot-to-robot interaction. So in this video, we see also from Boston Dynamics in 2018, we see Spot. Spot realizes that it can't get through the door. So Spot calls over his friend, who has a robotic arm on him. And the robot is actually able to perceive the environment, interact with the environment, determine where the door handle is, open the door, hold it open, and let his friend through. So we have come quite a long way in the past 5 to 6 years in terms of robotics. And what I want to talk about is how we could use robotics as prosthetic hands, and particularly how we can use this as augmenting human performance. So I want to first introduce you to my friend here, cortical homunculus. And what this figurine actually depicts is the amount of the brain that is dedicated to motor movement, for each body part. So we can see here in this pie chart in the upper right-hand corner that 40% of your brain that is dedicated to motor movement actually is dedicated just to your hands. So being very small body parts on our human self, this is actually amazing, which kind of illustrates why it has been so hard. 50 to 60 years of research, roboticists have tried to actually mimic dexterous manipulation with robotic hands and have not been able to do so. It's just because our hands are so very complex. So when it comes to prosthetics, I want to first define as an artificial device that intends to restore the normal function of a missing body part. I really want to highlight the restore normal function. And for the most part, we try to simplify this as much as possible. Clearly, having 21 joints, as I talked about earlier, you want to be able to simplify it so someone is able to easily control it. And the way we do that, especially in a myoelectric prosthetic hand, we use these things called electrodes. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in a bit. But essentially what they are little stickers that you'll put on your muscles, and they basically measure the potential differences across your muscles. So no matter where an amputee has been amputated, you could actually trace all the muscles that control your hand all the way back into your pectoral muscle. So usually you could get 3 to 5 electrodes on a muscle in order to control the hand, which makes it, again, really difficult to control all 21 joints that we talked about earlier. So moving on from the electrodes then put a signal into this microcontroller that then has a battery, and then finally there's some sort of motor that actually controls the hand. So when it comes to actually controlling the prosthetic, I really want to highlight how I want to define what a prosthetic is. And it really comes down to how many inputs do we have, can we actually control the device. So we can kind of think of it as a little analogy where we have a push button, maybe it has 2 inputs. We have a joystick, it has 4 inputs, you go up, down, left, or right. Or finally you have all this control and you have a full controller itself. There's 10 inputs, you have up, down, left, and right on the directional pad, and then 6 buttons. And we can kind of think of this as the idea of having less input to more input. So when it comes to an actual prosthetic device, I was talking about the electrodes, and this is a technology called Electromyography, or EMG. And essentially what we see here in this picture, obviously this is not an amputee, but we see here these little stickers that are actually on the skin of the patient. And as he activates his muscles and contracts his muscles, there's little signals that are sent through the electrode into the computer, and the computer is able to understand these signals. Now, when we talk about EMG, like I said, you could usually get 3 to 5 inputs, which sort of limits what you can do in terms of prosthetics. Something called EEG, or electroencephalography, is clearly something that looks like basically a helmet that you put on one's head. You have more inputs than you would with EMG, but clearly this is something that's very invasive. People wearing prosthetics don't want to go around wearing this type of helmet. But with doing so, you're able to get more inputs, and ultimately you're able to get more control if desired. So in comparing these two, EMG is typically used because it's less invasive, it's cheaper. But you can kind of think of this as the joystick versus the controller analogy that we talked about earlier. So in doing so, with this analogy, we have to sort of understand our limitations for our assistive devices and understand that we only have so many control inputs in order to actually control them. So when it comes to a robotic hand versus a prosthetic hand, we saw that really cool OpenAI hand on the left, and then we have Luke Skywalker's hand on the right. Unfortunately, neither of them are actually prosthetics. So as we talked about before, the OpenAI hand has 21 independent joints. It's about $150,000. It's heavy, it's expensive. It's just impractical to actually put on a human. Whereas Luke Skywalker's hand is cool, but it's still not a prosthetic because it's too difficult to control. And what that really comes back to is what we defined earlier, is being able to restore the normal function of a missing body part. If we're not able to actually control it, we can't actually restore the normal function. But some robotic hands that are out there right now that we can control are things like the iLimb hand and the Bionic hand, where the iLimb hand has 14 programmable grip patterns, has 4 control inputs, so we're able to control it, that's great. The Bionic hand is a little over $10,000, just the hand itself without the socket. It has 5 motor-specific grasp types, and ultimately we can control it. So these are all great things. So as we have our cyborg here, we're able to augment performance by providing him with a prosthetic hand, and that is a good thing. So moving on from there, I want to now talk about exoskeletons, something a little bit more futuristic, especially when it comes to assistive technologies. An exoskeleton is a rigid external device for providing assistance, support, and protection. And we kind of see these depicted here on the left, where they really have three main use cases. They often come in the form of rehabilitation, reducing fatigue, often in the workplace, especially for people that are working overhead or working with heavy equipment day to day. And also the military is very interested in that. In fact, the military is actually the largest funder for this research, being able to equip soldiers with this sort of technology to help reduce fatigue on the battlefield. They're controlled by either EMG or EEG, which we talked about, which is either sort of the control joystick analogy or the controller itself. But of course, as we could understand, there's plenty of drawbacks. They're upwards of $70,000. They have delayed sensing because they require so much input, and they're often very user specific. Just because they are basically fitted to one person's size, it's hard to be able to take it off me and give it to Brooks. So I want to first show you this video. So this is a stroke patient. So a exoskeleton would be implemented for rehabilitation. And we can see here, and as noted in the audio, that the patient didn't have quite the control over the left side of his body as he did his right after his stroke. And after retrofitting himself with this Cyberdyne exoskeleton, we see that his walking gait becomes a little bit more natural, and he also notes during this video that he actually feels like he has the same amount of control over the left and right side of his body. Now this is controlled through EMG signals. Right on the back here is where they put the electrodes, and we can see he's even able to climb steps similar to that as you would see with a normal walking pattern. Finally, in reducing fatigue, I want to introduce you to this exoskeleton called Max. Max is a fatigue-reducing exoskeleton designed for the workplace. It actually comes in 3 different parts. There's one for the torso, one for the core, and then one for the legs. And you could sort of imagine this being retrofitted on a worker that maybe has to carry heavy bags of concrete around the workplace, maybe is working overhead, especially when it comes to insurance and liability issues. This is something where if a worker is retrofitted with this technology, is able to reduce forces up to 60% with this Max exoskeleton, whereas some other exoskeletons are actually able to reduce even more, up to 80 to 85%. And finally, as our futuristic view of this, I will introduce you to an exoskeleton little commercial that the United States military put out. So as I was saying earlier, soldiers in a normal day-to-day might be carrying 30 pounds to 70 pounds on their backs throughout the battlefield. And in order to keep, in hopes of keeping soldiers more vigilant and aware of their surroundings and more energy, being able to retrofit soldiers with this sort of technology seems beneficial for future endeavors. So the big overarching question with all of this and all of this technology is, where do we actually go next? And to answer that question, I will introduce you to Hugh Herr. Hugh Herr is a fairly famous roboticist from MIT, and he is actually a paraplegic. So he did this, this TED Talk back in 2018, How We'll Become Cyborgs and Extend Human Potential. And in all definitions of the word robot, each one of his legs are actually its own robot. So they actually communicate with one another. As he walks, they're able to adapt to what he would like to do. He's actually an avid rock climber, and that's actually how he lost his legs. So while he's rock climbing, they're able to change stiffnesses, and it actually gives him a leg up in actually being able to perform certain walking gaits. Now we'll see here on the left, these are what his legs actually look like. Each one, like I said, is basically its own individual robot. And you're able to, with a system of springs and dampers, you're able to adapt his walking gait. So here we'll see with the EMG, the electrodes on the residual limb. This is how the limb is actuated. And we can see now with him walking, He walked very similar and very natural to that of a human. And he has since commercialized this product, and it is a upcoming business. So now, with our cyborg, we can retrofit our cyborg with a prosthetic leg, which is a great thing. So what we've seen today is how we can build better bodies through exercise. We have seen how we can build better bodies through healing and regeneration. And finally, we have seen how we can build better bodies by augmenting function using robotics. And at this point, I will invite Titus back up to introduce next month's talk.
Thanks, Andy. So before we go to questions, I would like to thank you all for coming and listening to us on behalf of the speakers, the coordinators, and everyone in Science in the News. I would also like to mention that we are very thankful to the library for giving us this opportunity and for hosting us. So our next Science in the News talk is on the mysteries of evolution, and it's coming up soon. And there is a talk in this library as well, so stay tuned. So with that, I will invite all the three speakers back up to answer any question that you may have.